everyone. Thank you for coming this evening out in the cold, the Budapest cold. This is a discussion, presentations followed by discussion, I should say, on the question of is liberalism a threat to religion? The history of the ideology of liberalism cannot be told without reference to the wars of religion, which of course are very significant in this region. Sparked off by the Reformation in the 16th century, these wars took a bloody toll on Europe. They resulted in 120 years of intermittent war and left millions dead. Looking back at the carnage, early liberal thinkers were disgusted and saw the new political ideology of liberalism as a solution. By promoting religious tolerance, these sorts of wars could be avoided. Yet for every liberal Enlightenment thinker who genuinely sought to promote religious toleration, there was one who was actively hostile to religion itself. Voltaire and Rousseau preached religious toleration, but when the French revolutionaries carried their program to what they saw as its logical conclusion, they tried to institute a state-backed cult of reason and installed a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral. Today, the debate has turned to whether liberalism and religion are compatible with one another. As we see ever more extreme strains of liberalism bubble up in the public square, and as these strains go increasingly authoritarian in nature, some are questioning whether liberalism is a political ideology that preaches toleration or whether it is one that seeks to eliminate religion altogether. Joining me to discuss this are Professor Andrew Koppelman, who's the Professor of Law, Political Science and Philosophy at Northwestern University, and Jacob Williams, a PhD student at Oxford University who is currently specializing in the question of liberalism and post-liberalism. So with that, I will give the floor to Jacob, who can get the conversation started. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Danube Institute and an honor to be speaking alongside two thinkers as prominent and insightful as Andrew Koppelman and Philip Pilkington. The late conservative philosopher Sir Roger Scruton, about whose views on religion, freedom and virtue I wrote in my master's thesis a few years ago, once described his work in Hungary as helping people whose religious and other liberties had been denied by the horrors of communism to live in truth. And if the religious impulse in humanity is, as I think it is, fundamentally an impulse towards the pursuit of and harmony with truth, then there are few questions more pressing and important than that of whether the free expression of this impulse is again threatened, this time by a new and very different ideology. The question I've been asked to address today is whether liberalism is a threat to religious liberty. For liberals like Andrew, the question can sound at first glance paradoxical. Liberalism was invented to protect religious liberty against the confessional states of the 16th and 17th centuries. Few, if any, prominent liberal philosophers have denied that religious freedom of some kind is a central and important liberty that we have strong reasons to protect. But on the other side of the question, post-liberals like Philip believe that liberalism is a coercive, imperialistic ideology bent on destroying any kind of hierarchy of values or belief in transcendent morality, even if freely and uncoercedly embraced by individuals and groups in a liberal civil society. So how can my two interlocutors say such different and contradictory things about this thing called liberalism? And what, in short, do we really talk about when we talk about liberalism? So I want to suggest here the tendency of liberals and post-liberals to engage in a kind of dialogue of the deaf on this issue, to talk past one another, arises from the fact that they very often mean by liberalism two quite different things that belong to two fundamentally different categories. Both sides, in interpreting each other's claims, make what the philosopher Gilbert Ryle called a category mistake. To give a very English example of this mistake, a foreigner attends a cricket match and his local companion explains to him the role of each player in the game. This person throws the ball, this one hits it with a bat, the other attempts to catch it, and so on. Turning to the local companion, the foreigner then asks, but who exactly is responsible for providing the team spirit? Now, the question doesn't make any sense because providing team spirit belongs to a fundamentally different category of thing to throwing a ball or hitting it with a bat. The former is something a collective does through 1,000 coordinated actions, the latter are things individuals do with their bodies. And something similar to this mistake is going on when liberal academics like Andrew debate post-liberal thinkers like Philip, because liberalism in Andrew's vocabulary means something fundamentally different in a fundamentally different category to what it denotes in Philip's vocabulary. So what are these two categories? Another prominent post-liberal, Adrian Vermeulen, writes that political liberalism as theory gets almost no purchase on the concrete operation and lived reality of actually existing liberal regimes. He goes on to claim liberal theorists are best understood as working in a genre that bears roughly the same relationship to any actually existing liberal political order as the novels of J.K. Rowling bear to the current United Kingdom. Now, I think Vermeulen is exaggerating here, and I think he would accept that he is, but the distinction he's getting at is an important one. There is a difference between liberalism as a theory, a body of ideas telling us how a society should be run, discussed by academics and philosophers like John Rawls or Ronald Dworkin, and liberalism as a real-world political practice, or, to use the term that many post-liberals like Patrick Deneen prefer, which comes from Leo Strauss, a regime. So when liberal academics like Andrew talk about liberalism, they mean primarily the theory. When post-liberals like Philip talk about it, they mean primarily the regime. So we're talking past one another because we use the same term to denote a thing in a fundamentally different category. Liberals like Andrew will quite rightly protest that liberal theory doesn't endorse the types of suppression of religious freedom that post-liberals are worried about. Peruse the works of Rawls or Dworkin, they explain, you won't find anything that justifies taking children away from parents who don't affirm transgenderism, forcing churches to conduct same-sex marriages, or introducing draconian hate speech laws. And liberals like Andrew are right as far as that goes. But at the same time, post-liberals like Philip will point to the actually existing coercive liberalism of real-world liberal states. And these states and movements appear to rely upon liberal ideas in some way, even if they deviate from the exact recommendations of liberal theory. In Britain, for example, there's a very prominent and influential campaign to ban so-called anti-LGBT conversion therapy. And that's a ban that, if you did it proportionally and carefully and targeted abusive medical treatments, wouldn't have to compromise religious freedom. But this campaign explicitly wants to include casual conversations and private prayers if these conversations or prayers express the belief that gay people should try to change or not act on their sexual desires. In parts of Australia, a similar law already appears, because it's very vague, I say appears, to make it illegal for a minister of religion to advise a gay person not to have gay sex. And it seems odd to say that campaigns like this have nothing to do with liberalism. And I think that post-liberals like Philip are right about that too. So what, then, is the relationship between this kind of real-world movement for what we might call coercive progressivism and liberalism? So in work that I produce as part of my PhD research at Oxford, where I've had the pleasure of discussing with Andrew previously, I argue that we should interpret post-liberals like Philip and also people like Deneen and Vermeulen as defending what I call the coercive liberalism thesis. This is the claim that the project of implementing the ideas of liberal theory, which do not imply support for coercive progressivism, nevertheless tends over time to produce a society that practices coercive progressivism. So implementing liberal theory in a state, a regime, tends to cause that regime to decay into one that is not liberal, a regime that is ordered around coercive progressivism, in other words, around compelling citizens to embrace a progressive vision of the human good. What is this vision of the human good? Why do post-liberals like Philip think that despite the fact that liberal theory doesn't recommend this coercion and is even contradicted by it, coercive progressivism nevertheless draws in some way on liberal ideas? Well, to explain this, I think we should turn to what the American sociologist Robert Bellah in the 1980s called expressive individualism. This is the idea that an individual's highest good consists of expressing and fulfilling their deeply felt intimations and desires, whatever they happen to be. Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, also written in the 1980s, identified a very similar notion which he called value positing. The value positing personality just posits, arbitrarily decides that certain things are of value, And presumably, if the choice is really arbitrary and not based on any external criteria, does so on the basis of some kind of desire or internal intimation. So what expressive individualism and value positing reject is the idea there are standards of evaluation, strong evaluations, to use the philosopher Charles Taylor's phrase, by which we can and should appraise and evaluate our desires and intimations which themselves transcend desire. So to be clear, I'm not talking about radical egoism. Expressive individualism isn't the idea we should never restrain our desires to protect other people, but it's the claim that at bottom, all the reasons you have to protect other people boil down to respecting their own rights to engage in expressive individualism. And I'm also not claiming that you have to be a theist or to be religious to embrace strong evaluation. Plato's idea of the well-ordered soul, balancing reason, spirit, and appetite is also a form of strong evaluation. Now, expressive individualism isn't endorsed by any liberal theorist that I'm aware of, but it does bear a strong resemblance to ideals of personal autonomy that are defended by liberals. And I think this is the reason that we suspect, rightly, that its spread in the culture of late liberal societies has something to do with their implementation of the ideals of autonomy that liberal theories do uphold. Now, a very interesting story explaining this is told by Alexandre Lefebvre in his recent book, Liberalism as a Way of Life. So this 2024 book is very, very candid and honest about what I think are some of the sociological and cultural effects of contemporary liberal regimes. Lefebvre also agrees with many of the claims that post-liberals make, people like Deneen, Vermeulen, and Philip, about liberal societies. He doesn't defend the coercive liberalism thesis, but he does think liberal regimes tend to make their citizens into expressive individualists. How do they do so? Well, he argues a large and increasing number of citizens in these contemporary liberal democracies lack any conception of human flourishing that can be specified independently of liberal concepts and ideas. These citizens identify the good life with treating other people as free and equal citizens and taking part in society as a fair scheme of cooperation, and nothing else. This is liberalism as a way of life. It's a more or less comprehensive view of human flourishing assembled from the moral norms embedded in liberal institutions and practices. And in this way of life, liberal ideas like public reason or reflective equilibrium, these are Rawls's ideas, they become not just ways of thinking about political justice, they become spiritual exercises, ways of thinking through your ultimate commitments about the value of human life. That is not what liberal theorists defend, but it is the consequence of living in a society where these liberal ideas are the only ones that organize our society, where, as Lefebvre says, these liberal ideas have spread to every nook and cranny of the background culture of liberal democracies, marshalling all the forces of mass communication, popular culture, and the entertainment industry, all pervasive as water is to fish. So no wonder many people end up taking them as a guide to the good life. Now, I think that this view of human flourishing Lefebvre describes very clearly, but tacitly, relies upon what Bella called expressive individualism. How is this lifestyle liberal supposed to work out the content of her duties to other human beings? She has the idea that humans are free and equal, society is a fair scheme of cooperation, she has nothing else. How does she determine what it is to treat people as free and equal? What does that require? What are they free and equal with respect to? What is society supposed to fairly distribute? What is the currency, in other words, of political justice? And ultimately, which is the same thing, for the lifestyle liberal, personal virtue. The only way is by appealing to what people desire, so her conception of the human good ends up implicitly relying upon expressive individualism, rejecting strong evaluation. So as Lefebvre sums up, when asked about the existence of God or the immortality of the soul, the lifestyle liberal shrugs. We simply shrug, he says, indifferent and unconcerned. This individual must ultimately conceptualize her moral duties in terms of expressive individualism that appeal only to the fulfillment of persons' individual ultimate desires and intimations. So Lefebvre describes here a process of conceptual transformation produced by the conditions that liberal institutions tend to create. The liberal ideas in the first stage are intended by theorists to apply only to political institutions, to what Rawls calls the basic structure of society, but they're then transformed through the regime in the minds of citizens into expressive individualism as a way of life. So you do you, live your best life, these become the slogans of lifestyle liberalism and of expressive individualism. And I find this story very plausible. I look forward to hearing Andrew's view of it. Nevertheless, we still need to explain, how is it that the spread of expressive individualism leads itself to coercive progressivism? Well, the reason is because, if Lefebvre is correct, expressive individualism is spread through sub-rational means that citizens are often barely aware of. It's not an argument addressed to their reason, it bypasses their reason. It's cultural conditioning from which they can hardly escape. And therefore, individuals come to believe that it's almost impossible to reasonably reject expressive individualism, to believe in strong evaluation, to believe in standards above and beyond desire, because expressive individualism is so central to their psychic makeup and yet was never taught to them through rational argument, but only through the power of extremely pervasive and indeed all-consuming cultural suggestion. So persons who embrace expressive individualism in this way come to see any other view of human flourishing as obviously irrational and oppressive, and therefore deserving of little, if any, legal protection, hence coercive progressivism. Now, in my previous correspondence with Andrew, I suggested that as applied to human sexuality, sexual expressivism, the belief that because expressive individualism is true in the field of sex and romantic relationships, expressing traditional or religious views about sex and relationships is incompatible, for example, with treating gay people as free and equal citizens, is the hidden premise in progressive arguments for opposing religious exemptions from anti-LGBT discrimination laws. Andrew objected to this and said a more plausible hidden premise is just the view that gay relationships are intrinsically valuable, and he says this view is itself a form of strong evaluation. But I find this claim ambiguous, because you might think same-sex relationships are intrinsically valuable because and insofar some people deeply and stably desire them, and if that's your reason, that is not strong evaluation. Of course, some people might hold a different view, the spiritual value of a certain type of gay relationship, for example, but that would be strong evaluation, but that's clearly very marginal among coercive progressives and among the LGBT activist movement. So, I also struggle to see how Andrew's view of the hidden premises of this coercive progressivism can explain the observation made by other legal scholars like Douglas Laycock or Shai Feldblum that the vast majority of LGBT rights activists think that claims by religious conservatives to exemption from certain anti-discrimination laws have no weight at all. They believe there is simply no weight to be given to those claims whatsoever when deciding on the right thing to do. It's not clear how the view that gay relationships are intrinsically valuable gets you to the view that religious conservatives' claims should have no weight at all. And that's the first of our major disagreements. Now, the second concerns how we should predict the future of coercive progressivism. I think we should predict it will continue to grow because we should predict that the growth of expressive individualism and sexual expressivism, caused by all of the mechanisms that Lefebvre shows shape human consciousness in liberal regimes, will continue to operate. But I also think Andrew and I could make some progress on the second disagreement without resolving the first one. So how would we do this? Well, I think we can set aside claims about the deep structural reasons for the growth over the last 10 or 15 years for wokeism or coercive progressivism, and we can instead look at what the empirical data on the growth of this coercive ideology seems to predict. Now, Andrew has argued before that wokeism is just a blip, and he appeals to the sociologist Moussa Al-Ghabi, whose 2024 book, We Have Never Been Woke, argues that the reason for wokeism is just competition among elite knowledge workers, academics, and creative symbolic capitalists. When the demand for jobs in these occupations outstrips supply, people seeking these positions, they legitimize their privileges by embracing more and more radicalized conceptions of social justice to demonstrate their commitment to their profession's purported emancipatory project. And they are therefore incentivized to adopt wokeism and coercive progressivism. Now, Al-Ghabi then says that, well, these awakenings, of which he thinks there have been 4, will change little and peter out once the creative job market improves. I'm unconvinced by this claim for a number of reasons. First of all, although it's true, I think, that Al-Ghabi's identified certain important micro-foundations for the spread of coercive progressivism, the current wave will prove to be one with lasting consequences for 2 reasons. Firstly, wokeism has already spread well beyond these elite symbolic capitalists and creatives that Al-Ghabi blames. It's captured the imaginations of huge swathes of millennial and Gen Z populations in liberal democracies. And secondly, once a generation's ideological beliefs, including their beliefs about free speech and religious freedom, have crystallized in early adulthood, they tend not to change much afterwards. The political scientist Eric Kaufmann, in his 2024 book, The Third Awakening, provides the empirical data that demonstrates these claims. For example, 85% of British citizens above the age of 65 oppose the idea of publishers boycotting J.K. Rowling for her views on transgenderism, and only 3% support that idea. But among the younger groups of age 18 to 25, the split is nearly even. There are many other examples. Now, these surveys don't directly address the question of hard coercion by the state. As I pointed out in my review of Kaufmann, we haven't asked how many of these young people also think that Rowling should be imprisoned, but isn't it extremely likely that number's far higher than among cohorts where no one thinks she should be boycotted? I think it's very obvious it will be higher. Now, Kaufmann is also helpful on the second reason to predict the spread of woke. He cites empirical work by 3 California political scientists showing that over the last 100 years, every cohort has maintained, once reaching adulthood, its attitudes towards free speech and religious freedom. There is no reason to predict this will change. Now, Andrew's right, no one has a crystal ball, we can't see the future with certainty, but the normal rules of scientific inference license us to assume the woke beliefs of Gen Z will prove just as stable in adulthood as the beliefs of previous generations did. So if he disagrees, Andrew should explain why. And until then, I will assume the wokeness of Gen Z is a permanent fact about contemporary liberal democracies that will only become more important as older generations are replaced among the voters. So finally, having explained where I disagree with Andrew and why, I would like to end by explaining where I also disagree with Philip. So if I'm a post-liberal, I'm a soft post-liberal. Although I've argued there are deep structural features of liberal regimes that are causing the rise of coercive progressivism, I don't think this rise is absolutely inevitable. I also don't think we need to abandon basic rights protections that are essential to basic or classical, if you like, liberalism, like the right to a fair trial, competitive elections, or protections from ideological coercion in one's private life. So I'm not an integralist or a Christian nationalist or a neo-monarchist. I agree with the journalist Ross Douthat, we need a limited, meliorist response to decadence, not radical regime change. But I do think the structural tendency of liberalism to produce this coercive progressivism must be addressed, and it can in part be addressed through acknowledging this tendency and countering it through socially conservative and pro-religious cultural nudges, using non-coercive tools like family policy, restrictions on pornography, moderate and non-coercive promotion of religion. These are all tools that governments minded to do this, like the government in Hungary seems to be, might use to put their thumbs on the scales against expressive individualism and against coercive progressivism, and ultimately in favour of a liberalism that's more conservative and partly for that reason more durable and stable too. I agree with Andrew, liberalism, properly understood, protects both religious liberty and gay rights. We might disagree as to how far a stable and durable resolution of the tension between these two values will require a break with the kind of liberalism practiced for the last few decades. And in my previous discussions with Philip, we've agreed that one important resource we might quarry from to strengthen a better, more conservative and more stable kind of liberalism are the ideas of so-called new natural law theory that tries to identify the basic goods to which human life is oriented, the goods that ground strong evaluation, in a way that doesn't depend on any specific theology or religion, and that gives us strong reasons to oppose religious coercion. Now, to conclude, I just want to point out a very interesting observation that Andrew and I discussed in our previous correspondence. So Andrew took issue with my claim in my review of Kaufmann's book that a plausible future for the United States might involve the mass removal of children from gender-critical homes, the forced closure of conservative religious schools or churches that don't conduct same-sex marriages, and the repeal or rewriting of the First Amendment to permit draconian hate speech legislation. As I summed up, a gender-neutral shoe stamping on a human face forever. But I don't think this Orwellian outcome is inevitable, or that the only way to prevent it is to stomp instead on the rights of progressives. So I think that Andrew is right to reject the idea, embraced by some post-liberals, that it is inevitable that someone will end up being bullied and humiliated by the law, and I think that a more robust, more conservative, more stable liberalism grounded in natural law is the best way to avoid anyone suffering this fate. Thank you for listening.
I don't have a timer, could I?
Oh, yeah, of course. You start it when you're ready.
I need to begin by thanking Jacob for letting me borrow his phone as a timer. And I want to thank the Budapest Institute for inviting me here. This has been a fabulous opportunity, and my life has been consumed for weeks with an extended exchange with my interlocutors via email, which he's referred to, and I've had so much fun. So thank you to begin with. So the topic of our panel initially struck me as strangely misconceived because the idea of religious liberty is an artifact of liberalism, which beginning in the late Renaissance supplanted the then common notion that heretical religious beliefs were intolerable and needed to be forcibly suppressed by the state. It's part of the larger liberal commitment to allowing people to live as they like. Yet the danger that liberalism allegedly presents to religion is a prominent theme in post-liberal writing, including that of my interlocutors today. So I read Philip's book, The Collapse of Global Liberalism. He defines liberalism as the Enlightenment political ideology par excellence that sought to level and rationalize social and political relationships. Its target has always been hierarchical structures in politics and society at large. And so he says that religion is inherently illiberal because it imposes a completely hierarchical, non-liberal worldview on its adherents, which is why liberals tend either to hate or distrust religion. Well, I can't think of a single liberal philosopher or politician, since we're talking about actual existing liberalism, who understands their project this way. And there are plenty of religious liberals. The theorists do test hierarchies with something like John Rawls's difference principle. It asks that inequalities be justified, but lots of inequalities can be justified. The classic Lockean liberal response to diversity is to draw clear boundaries to create a private sphere where citizens are free to exercise their religion in ways that other citizens find repugnant. Locke thought that diversity doesn't need to produce conflict as long as there were clear boundaries of property. A congregation could do what it liked within its own building, and those who regarded its activities as heretical were free to assemble in a different building of their own. The relationship between Locke's theory of property and his theory of religious liberty deserves more exploration than it's gotten. Hierarchical structures within religion are perfectly acceptable to liberalism as long as they're freely consented to by everyone within those structures. Hierarchy has to be justified, but consent suffices to justify. Shifting our focus from theory to practice, American law, I'm an American, so I'm going to focus on American law here, which I take to be liberal. American law has never questioned the right of the Catholic Church to confine the priesthood to males, or to impose on the priesthood difficult demands such as celibacy, or to condemn as immoral homosexual sex and contraception. Liberals believe in free speech, even for ideas we don't like. Traditional religion does face cultural difficulties, but post-liberals tend to exaggerate them to the point of paranoid delusion. For example, Patrick Deneen writes in his most recent book that the liberal state is forcing churches, religious organizations, and other traditional communities to conform to progressive ideology. His only evidence, if you check his footnotes, is one possibly inappropriate FBI investigation of a group of right-wing Catholics, merely an investigation which led to no arrests and didn't force anyone to do anything. The question this panel asks is strangely paradoxical. It's something like asking, well, is soccer a threat to the practice of scoring goals? It's just odd. Well, I'm happy to say that my confusion's been cleared up somewhat by unpublished work by Jacob, which he kindly shared with me. One point that he emphasizes is the difference between liberalism as a theory and liberalism as a real-world political practice. And he thinks that the threat he speaks of arises out of real-world political practice. So let me share with you a picture drawn not from theory, but from an actual existing liberal society, specifically New York City sometime around 2016 or 2017. A right-wing Twitter user posted a photograph with the caption, "This is the future that liberals want." Evidently, the intention was to arouse fear and revulsion toward both of the people in the photo and toward the regime that let such people into public spaces. And it backfired spectacularly. The post quickly became the object of viral ridicule. One user commented, "Religious freedom, kicky daytime drag looks, and a robust public transport program, sign me up." BuzzFeed tracked down the drag queen in the photo, who goes by the name of Gilda Wabbit. Gilda said, "I won't speak for all liberals, but my goal is for everyone, white, brown, drag queen, soccer mom, cisgender, trans, heterosexual, queer, working class, middle class, to be able to exist as they choose without judgment or fear." Now, post-liberals are clearly not among the enthusiasts, and they broadly fall into two categories. One, I think broadly consistent with the person who made the original post, are troubled that in this case, liberalism succeeded. We've got two people, and each of them looks like they're committed to a view of the world that doesn't leave much room for the other. Nonetheless, coexist peacefully, evidently by presuming that the other one has a right to be there. In the world that some post-liberals want, one or both of them would somehow be made to disappear. And if this is what you hope for, I just don't have a lot to say to you. Aristotle is right. Before people can begin to think about ethics, they need minimal, decent socialization. If your ideal is to make these people, one of or both of these people disappear, I find this ideal terrifying and sickening. We can't be friends. But there is a second variety of post-liberal who doesn't dispute that it might be very nice for different people to coexist. And that's an idea. It has religious roots. George Washington wrote to the Jews of Rhode Island that he wanted a regime where everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. He was, of course, quoting the book of Micah. These post-liberals think that it just isn't possible. Sooner or later, one tribe will attack the other, and the most likely attackers are Gilda Wabbit and her allies. I don't think these folks know much about Gilda Wabbit or about liberalism, and that gives me hope. The fear of Gilda is empirical and susceptible to empirical doubt and refutation. And the refutation is, there they are, it happened. Jacob is tempted to agree with the second kind of post-liberal. He argues that the post-liberal critique of liberalism consists of two claims: that liberal regimes have a structural logic characterized by the radicalization of voluntarist beliefs in the citizenry, which he calls the structural radicalization thesis, and that part of this logic involves a tendency to increasingly restrict the liberty of traditionalists. That's the coercive liberalism thesis. And these claims are modeled on Leo Strauss's effort to discern the logic of regimes. A regime embodies certain assumptions about politics, and it has certain structural tendencies to produce certain political outcomes. Now, I think that Jacob is clearer on these issues than Deneen, who he presumes to be he thinks he's challenging, but I actually think he's better than Deneen. If the theses are correct, then radicalized liberalism is going to impose oppressive restrictions on traditionalists, even if that is not the official liberal line. The claim here is a familiar kind. It's structurally similar to one that Plato develops in Book 7 of the Republic. Socrates considers the various kinds of regime. He explains how each of them tends to manifest internal tensions that cause it to degenerate into a different and worse kind of regime. For instance, a regime like Sparta, a democracy based on the heroic pursuit of honor, tends eventually to get rich because they win wars. And that produces status competition based on wealth, and so it generates a new and unattractive kind of citizen. Plato writes, instead of men who love victory and honor, they finally become lovers of money-making and money. And they praise and admire the wealthy man while they dishonor the poor man. And then the regime becomes an oligarchy. And this generates what Karl Marx called a contradiction. The regime generates forces that undermine it. Communist regimes did this, something that Hungary has some acquaintance with. Lenin's revolutionary vanguard bears some resemblances to Plato's timocracy, people who define themselves by their devotion to a demanding ideal, but both regimes create tempting opportunities for wealth and so corrupt the ruling class. So Lenin is always already on the path to Brezhnev. And there was a similar effect when the papacy was given political power. When the papacy is associated with political power and wealth, the Borgias get interested. Well, the structural radicalization thesis is a claim like that. Liberal theorists may not intend to produce a regime that restricts traditionalists' rights to freedom of association and freedom of speech. They would, in fact, defend such rights, but the regime, they claim, is going to produce people who don't respect those rights, just as Brezhnev and his minions didn't give a damn about the well-being of the working classes. That's the coercive liberalism thesis. My objection to the thesis as Jacob just presented it is I don't really see any evidence that it's true. That, liberals, there are causal claims about tyrannical liberalism, that liberalism seeks the forced, I'm looking at Deneen here, the forced imposition of radical expressivism upon the population by the power elite, the eradication of any law, custom, or tradition that has as its premise that there are objective conditions of good that require public support. But I don't see how this disposition arises out of the expressive individualism that Jacob described, even if that becomes common in a liberal society. Why would expressive individualists bother non-voluntarists who aren't violating anyone's rights? There's a problem if the communities coerce their members or radically restrict their opportunities, but if the people who are part of those communities want to be there, if the woman really wants to wear her burqa, the Lockean-Millian approach dictates that they be left alone, and this is not something that happens only in an ideal world of theory. There she is on the subway, and nobody's bothering her. So I guess I need to hear more about why this wokeness, which I certainly agree, there are aspects, there are people on the left who want to repress I'm trying to radically compress what I wrote here to stay within my time limit, one example that we have had in the United States is the application of anti-discrimination law to religious dissenters. From that, there's a famous case involving a bake shop. But how does expressive individualism lead to a movement toward repression of those views? As long as one isn't imposing on someone else, and anti-discrimination law is about engaging in the public sphere with commerce that is normally anonymous and open to everyone. Absent the specialized case of anti-discrimination law, why shouldn't we be tolerant? You do you. Gilda Wabbit doesn't mind the woman in the burqa. That woman wants to wear it. Gilda yearns for a world where everyone can make their own fashion choices. Jacob says that liberalism tends to produce citizens who find it extremely difficult to acknowledge that other citizens might reasonably reject expressive individualism. And I'm ready to stipulate, maybe it is the case that Gilda Wabbit doesn't acknowledge the reasonableness of her seatmates' religious devotion. The people who dress like Gilda Wabbit tend not to be members of conservative religious communities. I can offer this as a generalization. But actual existing liberalism only demands that we act reasonably, not that we believe reasonably. And as long as the woman in the burqa does not disturb or attack Gilda, which, I mean, she seems to say with her hands folded, it doesn't seem to be a problem. It is not clear that even if Gilda regards the woman in the burqa as irrational, why the open display of her views, and just by wearing the burqa, she is openly displaying her religious views. I don't see how that generates the kind of sensitivity that leads to repress religious views. Now, the other aspect of wokeness that Jacob emphasized was a tendency to be hypersensitive about these matters, to regard the public display of traditional views as itself an injury, to publicly proclaim that homosexuality is immoral. And that is at odds with liberalism, because the idea of free speech means that mere offense, I won't say mere, because I don't want to prejudge, offense at views that attack one in one's life, the view that I suspect the woman in the burqa believes that Gilda is fundamentally mistaken about how to live, that her whole life is a mistake, that she ought to convert and engage in a completely different view of the world, is something that Gilda ought not to put up with. The whole idea of free speech is that we have to be resilient in the face of challenges to our fundamental moral commitments. That, however, that aspect of free speech isn't anything new. That is a consequence of liberalism going back to the age of religious wars. The idea that you can have a neighbor next door to you who is openly and unapologetically Protestant. It's hard now for people to imagine the outrage that that once elicited. The whole idea of free speech and liberalism is we're going to have people who radically disagree about the meaning of life living together in peace. The coercive liberalism thesis is the claim that it just is not possible to sustain a regime like that. Now, I won't go into, I respond to the challenge to Al-Gharbi. One of the things that came up in our earlier discussion today is on the question of what are the causes of wokeness. I don't think that in order to refute the coercive liberalism thesis, I need to make any claim at all about the causes of wokeness. I just have to say that this causal claim is not proven, in the same way that if I have a neighbor who got cancer 6 months ago and they want to know what caused my cancer, and I say, well, don't you understand, a couple of years before that, the Chicago Cubs won the World Series. And that's the cause of your cancer. It happened before, the cancer happened afterward, that's the cause. I think that I can refute that thesis without telling you anything at all about the cause of your cancer. It's not clear why there has been this eruption of wokeness that generates an attitude that might very well be willing to coercively repress J.K. Rowling. Yeah, I don't know, but I need more evidence than I've heard that liberalism is to blame. And whether it's possible to have an actual regime where religious conservatives aren't repressed, even after the sexual revolution, I can only say, behold.
Okay, so my thanks to Andrew for a very robust and constructive response. And it seems to me that there are two main areas on which we disagree, so I'm going to do the best I can to defend my view on both those areas in a short time. And the first is, what political attitudes are congruent with expressive individualism. So Andrew thinks that citizens who embrace expressive individualism and reject strong evaluation will, for this reason, tend to be tolerant of persons who do embrace strong evaluation. Andrew claims that such people may act reasonably even if they don't believe reasonably, i.e., believe that traditional citizens hold their own views reasonably. So in Andrew's telling, persons who think that all evaluative standards ultimately boil down to the compossible fulfillment of individuals' desires and intimations have reasons, deriving from the very fact that they think this, to be tolerant of persons who disagree. But I think the opposite. The kind of sub-rational rejection of strong evaluation that tends to be spread by liberal regimes gives you strong reasons to be intolerant of persons who disagree. Consider this idea in the context of the gay rights and religious liberty debate. Andrew acknowledges that gay rights activists sometimes wrongly devalue religious objections, and he claims they do so because they think those objections are a mask for prejudice. Why would any educated and intelligent person think the views of human sexuality found in millennia of theological anthropology, important classical philosophers, and sophisticated recent philosophers like new natural law theorists are nothing but a mask for prejudice, for what the US Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy called a bare desire to harm an often victimized group? It cannot simply be that gay rights activists believe sexual pleasure and bonding are great goods and it's cruel and stupid to deny them to gay people. Denying such goods, if they are goods to gay people, isn't the issue. No one is denied these goods if a small baker refuses to cater a wedding or a pastor says that homosexual acts are sinful. There are other bakers, there are other things to do on a Sunday. Nor does the claim that sexual pleasure and bonding are objective goods, outside of desire in some sense, resonate with my experience interacting with the radical LGBT rights activists. If this is what they believe, why do they also insist that celibacy is a great good for the asexual, or that long periods of abstinence are good for the demisexual? What's really doing the work is the appeal to desire. Many LGBT rights activists struggle to comprehend the idea that someone could sincerely be committed to the strong evaluation of sexual desires, and they therefore attribute such expressions to mere bigotry and animus. Now, Andrew thinks that expressive individualism leads you either to active tolerance or to a passively tolerant apolitical outlook. I mentioned earlier that Bella's expressive individualism is close to Alan Bloom's value positing, and it seems to me Bloom can explain how this intolerance arises. Consider the opening passage of Bloom's Closing of the American Mind. Almost every student entering the university believes, or says he believes, that truth is relative. If this belief is put to the test, one can count on the student's reaction. They will be uncomprehending. Bloom goes on to note that for the proto-woke Generation X students he was teaching, the relativity of truth is a moral postulate. Challenging this postulate leads immediately to disbelief and indignation. This is precisely the psychology of the intolerant LGBT rights activists. Not all truth is relative, but all strong evaluations about the human good are. And because this implicit, tacit relativism or expressive individualism about the good is the psychological bedrock of these students' commitments to freedom, any challenge to this relativism is experienced as both incomprehensible and absolutely wrong. So believing that same-sex relationships might in some respect be less good than opposite-sex ones is incomprehensible and absolutely wrong. And that is why these activists disvalue religious objections. Relativism about the good, absolutism about the rightness of respecting this relativism in thought, word, and deed. Now, our second disagreement concerns the mechanisms behind the rise of woke. Now, Andrew has quite cogently argued that we don't need to defend the entirety of Al-Gharbi's theory, which I think I've shown is very implausible and can explain very little of what is happening. Rather, Andrew points out, well, maybe we just don't know the cause of this rise. Maybe it's happening. Maybe there will be a permanent shift towards wokeism. Maybe it will be a permanent generational change towards coercive progressivism. But we haven't proven with certainty it's caused by liberalism. Well, that's fair. I will concede I haven't proved this with certainty. But what I will simply ask is this. Given that I provided a very plausible, spelt out, detailed mechanism appealing to the empirical data cited by Kaufman, to the psychological and, as it were, cultural anthropological mechanisms but I've illustrated by appealing to Bella, to Bloom, to Lefebvre. Given all of this, is it not highly plausible that this is caused by liberalism, since we have a highly plausible causal story of how this happens? And until some alternative, more plausible causal story is put on the table, or data is cited to directly refute the causal story I've told, I think I'm entitled to continue to believe it. I think we should all continue to believe it, not as an absolute certainty or a claim that we think has been proven beyond all reasonable doubt, but as a reasonable presumption, as the theory that best fits the evidence we have. So I think the burden of proof is on those who argue that this theory or this account of the rise of wokeism as linking it to liberalism in practice is false. I think the burden of proof is on people like Andrew who deny this to provide that alternative causal story or explain exactly which data contradict that story and make it untenable. So that was my response to our conflicting beliefs about wokeism. And above all, I just think the issue is far too important to counsel complacency, and I welcome Andrew's qualification or distancing himself from the complacency that Al-Ghabi's view seems to sanction. Thank you.
So,
I'll respond, maybe. Right to respond. I think it's in Locke or something. My own work was brought up there a few times, so I won't go on for too long, but I might just clarify some positions. I thought the drag queen example with the Muslim, the devout Muslim, was quite interesting. But I think it does show, I don't mean to be offensive, but the naivete of liberals. The drag queen may tell that story to the New York Times, or her public relations firm might do so for her. I don't know. The Muslim does not view this as a simple disagreement. I think she probably would like to enact violence on the drag queen, and I think not saying, oh, well, that doesn't fit into the a priori structure of liberalism is just naive relative to human nature. I'd say the same thing. It's something that drives me a little bit crazy about liberal ideology is you were talking about the empirical verification. It seems unfair that post-liberals have to adhere to like econometric style evidentiary basis to argue in favor of a causality for wokeism, and every precept that liberals has is an a priori, because the entire ideology is structured non-empirically. And then when you bring up an empirical claim like human beings can be violent toward one another if they're put in very extreme circumstances like that metro, oh, well, that's not in line with the a priori system of liberal ethics. To respond directly to Andrew's point that he doesn't know any liberals, or he's not aware of any liberal thinkers that are anti-religious. Voltaire is clearly anti-religious. He mocks religion consistently. He's clearly violent toward religion. The thing is, this goes back to the naivete. I'm sure there are plenty of liberal thinkers who are the a priori ideal, who are the perfect liberal, and who really believe, everyone should just get along. But there are also liberal thinkers who really don't like religion, like Voltaire, and their followers who, enacted the French Revolution, which was not tolerant at all. And the reason for that isn't irrational. It's that they recognize something. Somebody like Voltaire, or somebody like a woke person or whatever, recognizes that there is social coercion in society. If you are raised in a devout Catholic household, in some sense, your parents have imposed those ideals on you. And liberals like Voltaire, or the woke, or any of these people who are all throughout history, they're not a recent phenomenon. Those people recognize that social coercion, and they're correct to recognize it because it's true. And maybe it doesn't fit in the a priori system of liberals, but it is true. And they're right to recognize that if I have children and raise them in a very restrictive traditional Catholic environment, they are vastly more likely to be that way for the rest of their life than somebody who's lived in a liberal environment. These are just kind of social realities. Again, liberalism, to my mind, suffers from too much abstraction. I think the FBI example, I must say I'm a little bit concerned that you don't see that as highly worrying, that the secret police of the United States government would start to infiltrate Catholic groups. I mean, that really is stuff that you'd find in the Soviet Union, frankly, literally. But, beyond that, do we really not think this is going to get worse? I mean, we had conversations beforehand, and we know that in every other country, in European countries where these things have gone further, in Britain, for example, or in the European continent, they don't end at the FBI investigation that's eventually shut down by whoever shut it down. They get worse and worse and worse. And eventually you end up, the thing we were discussing earlier, with a woman praying outside an abortion clinic in Britain and being arrested. Anyone who tells me this isn't going to happen in the United States because of a piece of paper called the Constitution, I think, again, is being naive. They're relying too much on a priori principles. My response to Jacob, I think we agree on a lot. I think we agree on the diagnosis, but I think we disagree on the future. Not so much on solutions. I think I agree with you on the solutions. They're quite modest. They're solutions that this country actually is not fully pursuing, actually, but largely pursuing. And they don't result in some authoritarian horror government. I mean, it's just not true. And they're not actually out of place in a modern world, and they're not going back to medieval guild systems in the economy or anything like that. But I think what we do disagree on is that I don't think we can go back to what I call soft liberalism. This is the liberalism of the 1950s in America, the white picket fence and everybody going to church on Sunday, even if they don't believe it, as part of social pressure and so on. I don't think we're going back to that, because I think the mask has slipped from liberalism. And the reason for the mask slipping on liberalism is because it's finally been tried. That's been the problem. Liberalism's been an elite project for about 500 years, and it's only been tried in very minor forms. The only people who actually lived like liberals tended to be the upper classes, usually bohemian upper classes. You especially see this in 19th century Britain and in early 20th century Britain and America. And what happened in the past 20 or 30 years is that this liberal culture was democratized through mass media and so on. And so I think actually that's probably the end of the road, because I think the societies that they start to produce are dysfunctional. Again, we go back to the transgender lady or drag, I don't know, the category cross-dresser, whatever it is, sitting next to the Muslim. That society's not going to last. I'm sorry, the a priori principles are not going to work there. That's going to result in violence and conflict. And anyone who can't see that just doesn't want to see it. The final thing I think we slightly disagree on is whether natural law is compatible with liberalism at all. I think they're completely polar opposite ideologies. In fact, one definition of liberalism, to my mind, would be the refusal to recognize natural law principles. And I strongly suspect that if you try and not reimpose, but reintegrate natural law into a liberal society, it'll just cease to be liberal. Because as I said, the direction of travel since John Locke writes his two treaties, or since the English Civil War, is basically more and more progressively more liberalism seeping into a society. I don't think that you go in the other direction. I think it tends to collapse, much like communism. So those are my kind of broad responses. I didn't think I was going to do that, but you guys were so interesting that I kind of felt the need. So now I'll slip into my more moderator position, and try and start the conversation. So, Andrew, you mentioned regime cycle theory, which I'm fascinated with in Plato's Republic. And this is definitely a component, increasingly, of post-liberal thinking, but I'm not sure that it's fully been articulated yet, but I think it will over time, because ultimately the claim, and I think I've kind of made that claim a few times now in what I've just said, is that there are better and worse ways to produce social stability. And this is just the reality that human beings have learned through time, because we're not ideal atomized subjects. We're people who get angry sometimes, and we're big monkeys in a way. So I think this goes to the point of what you call strong evaluation. It raises this question to me, right? To just really strip it down. And I want to address it to you, Andrew, because I think it's a difficulty to some of the things that you're saying. Do you think that telling people that they can do what they want all the time, right, within certain boundaries, so you're not allowed to murder, you're not allowed to beat people up, you're not allowed to, push the boundaries of assault? You could imagine the scene that we saw up there escalating to a very high point without anyone getting too badly hurt. I think we all know what we mean, bothering people. Do you think that allowing it up to that limit might possibly create a society in which people do actually tend to go over the limit more and more. So if you have too much do what you want, if you have too many people like that sitting next to each other that are so different from one another, do you not see any possibility that that could lead to severe social instability when the id in Freudian terms starts to break through the surface?
Well, I think that the answer to that depends on how they're socialized. The question you asked about the woman in the burqa is, there is a religious belief that historically has been associated in many places with oppression and violence. Is it possible for somebody who holds those beliefs to be a good citizen of a religious society, which might mean that they have to do a job on their religious beliefs such that those religious beliefs are compatible with liberalism? But of course, the set of religious beliefs that are most closely associated with homicidal violence around here isn't Islam, but Christianity. It was the Christians who murdered each other in large numbers. If Christianity could do it, I don't understand what it is about Islam that makes it more difficult. And in fact, American Muslims, we've got quite a lot of them now. They're perfectly nice people. I have not been introduced to the woman in the burqa, but she certainly seems to be behaving herself, and I guess that this is our fundamental disagreement. And if you tell me, well, she is. She might be behaving herself now, but any minute she's going to turn violent. So what we really need to worry about is what she's going to do in the future. I just want to know more evidence of that. One of the great things about making arguments from the future is that, that no evidence is available because the future hasn't happened yet. But, let's see how that goes. I do think that I am obligated to say something about Jacob's question, why would anyone think that views that are critical of homosexuality are associated with prejudice and a bare desire to harm? I would say the fact that one phenomenon that is deeply ingrained in American culture is a long history of horrific violence against gay people, which happened everywhere in the United States for decades, with the police either ignoring it or actively participating in it. And so the reason why gay rights activists see prejudice and hatred is personal experience. They have all encountered it. They have all suffered from it. Now, I think that it's a complicated matter because it coexists with genuine religious belief, but it seems to me that the people in every major city who were hospitalizing gay people by beating them with baseball bats weren't animated by traditional teachings about religion. That's a strand of the culture that, I think that gay rights activists miss this other aspect of it, the bare desire to harm is certainly there, and it's a massive fact in at least American culture.
Well, I think there's a number of... Oh, sorry. Okay, I think there's a number of interesting things to respond to here. I could say something about this question concerning Muslims and Islam, which is a very, very complicated one, and I think it would be somewhat naive to take Andrew's view to think that there are no reasons at all to think that within the tradition of Islamic thought you don't find any greater tendency towards a certain type of intolerance than you find perhaps at least in recent centuries, than you find in Christian thought. I don't take the view that it's completely impossible for a Muslim citizen to adopt sufficiently liberal values to live in a liberal society. I think it's entirely possible, and many Muslims do so. But whether or not that, nevertheless, it's perfectly reasonable for a state to view at very least certain interpretations of Islam as potentially concerning if they become too numerous. So I think we need to try to find a middle ground on that question. Now, Andrew then says, well, the reason that gay rights activists think that, or many of them, think that traditional religious views are associated with prejudice is the history of violence and indeed the presence of violence and cruelty towards gay people, which obviously exists, and I don't dispute, and nor do I dispute the fact that it's grossly unjust and cruel. But the claim is not that many of these activists think that the views of religious conservatives are associated with prejudice. The claim is that many of them think they are nothing but prejudice. And now, I still struggle to see why the fact that, yes, many people who often have nothing to do with these traditional theological views, as Andrew just pointed out, were cruel to gay people and sometimes still are, then leads these activists to infer that, well, the only reason you'd ever have for agreeing with Plato or Aquinas on homosexuality is just a bare desire to harm. It's such a massive leap of logic that I really think we have to appeal to something else. And it isn't just on this question of gay rights. You see it on every question in which, personal autonomy is at issue. We discussed the example of, in Britain, people being arrested for praying or holding up signs outside abortion clinics. Well, this isn't, perhaps Andrew's going to say, well, there's a history of cruelty towards pregnant women. Well, insofar as there were laws against abortion, which, of course, were justified on the basis of preventing cruelty to unborn children. We can debate whether or not unborn children ought to have rights, or whether they're really children or really people. We can have that discussion. But, it just seems very hard for me to understand that there's anything other, or rather that it's very hard for me to believe that what is not going on here is some radical conception of human autonomy, some view where just saying that I can't expel an entity from my womb, that I can't, or that I shouldn't, not that I can't, but that I shouldn't have promiscuous gay sex, just saying that somehow infringes my autonomy because you're suggesting a higher standard of evaluation. Strong evaluation. I think it's just clear psychologically that's what's going on, and the fact that there's this history of violence or cruelty or genuine prejudice doesn't explain the way these woke activists think. That's my response there, and yeah, I think that addresses most of... I do want to respond to Philip's claim about natural law. So actually, what I'd like to ask Philip is, if he thinks we can't go back to soft liberalism, then maybe we just have a terminological disagreement, because Philip says that the government in places like Hungary is already doing quite a lot of what I suggested a government could do, nudge people non-coercively towards religion, towards family values, etc. Now, I would just say that's compatible with soft liberalism. Maybe Philip disagrees, perhaps we're just defining liberalism differently. Natural law, again, I think the historical facts would speak against this view, at least if we're talking about the liberalism, as Philip says, of the 1950s. There were quite sophisticated attempts by, thinkers like John Courtney Murray, for example, at this time, to show how soft liberalism, minimal liberalism, at least opposition to coercion, could coexist with more conservative social views affirmed by certain views of natural law. I don't see the sharp opposition here, unless Philip means by liberalism something more radical and more demanding than what I mean.
Well, I'll just respond to that really quickly. I just mean the ideas, this ideological superstructure of neutral proceduralism. I just think it's going to be seen to have failed in the future. There are ideas that just run out of steam at a certain point. Often they're civilizational in nature. For example, the medieval regime, you might call it, operated under very different principles than the liberal regime, even than the post Counter-Reformation regime or anything like that. And I actually think there's a lot of value in the medieval tradition personally, but it's never coming back. Feudalism's not coming back. We're not going back to that, and not just for technological reasons. So I just kind of think that there are phases in history. I'm kind of Hegelian in this way. I think there are phases in history that are mainly driven by ideas and not material forces. And I think that we just might be witnessing the end of one of them. It's an empirical claim. It's not a theoretical, much less a theological claim. I just, to kind of move forward on, I think, what we're kind of coming out with here, because I wrote some of this stuff down too. I think what challenges liberalism at its most basic, not really at its most basic in terms of ideas or intellectually or anything like that, but I think in practice, is what we've already kind of latched onto here. I think everybody kind of has. And I think two examples we can use. One of them we're already talking about, which is gay conversion therapy, where you're effectively saying, I'm not making a moral judgment on this, but you're effectively saying you're not allowed to talk to that person about that. You're not allowed to try and convince that person about that. That's what we're saying, right? And that is not, in classical liberal theory, you're allowed to try and convince anybody of anything you want. So that is certainly empirically happening in liberal regimes. And that is happening on the part of people who I would argue come out of a liberal tradition and will call themselves liberals. If you look on the other side of Islam, and I'm not actually particularly anti-Islam or anything like that, but it poses an interesting question for Western societies because it's a very different religious structure. And personally, I think Muslims and Christians can live together and so on. That's a complicated question. We're going to have to get used to it. In Europe, I have different views than the alt-right on this, for what it's worth. But they are, it is interestingly different. And of course, one of the aspects of the Muslim religion is you're not allowed to convert. Under pain of death, you're not allowed to convert. Now, how do you deal with that pragmatically in a liberal society? Obviously, we cannot allow that because it would violate liberal laws against murder, for example. So presumably, and Andrew, I think you hinted at this, people would have to give up certain aspects of their religion. Now, to my mind, if you want a liberal society in which there's a very large Muslim population, you actually have to probably ban proselytizing. I mean, that's ultimately, if I'm a lawmaker, a pragmatic one, not this a priori stuff. If I'm a pragmatic lawmaker in the Interior Ministry here and we're dealing with a 20% Muslim population, and I say I don't want violence, I know that violence can result if we're not careful about this, I probably end up banning proselytizing. And that's not actually that dissimilar to the abortion scenario, the woman outside the abortion clinic, because she's sort of proselytizing. So the police forces in Britain are actually waking up to this, I think, empirically. And that's a very real politic aspect, because we can have theories all we want. At a certain point, the legal authorities need to maintain stability. And I think the gay conversion therapy is the civil society version, maybe, and the potential for having to stop proselytizing against Muslims in a future society would be the criminal aspect to that. I'm speaking from a very pragmatic governmental point of view. Andrew, maybe you'd...
I will simply report, I think, the United States is just a more liberal society than Britain. The case of the protester outside the abortion clinic would be an easy one. The claim that the protester outside the abortion clinic has a right to hold up her sign is going to be a matter of agreement between Clarence Thomas and Elena Kagan. It's just not controversial within American law. So, your prediction is that American law is going to move toward repressing the protester. I don't think so. American free speech law, which is an artifact of liberalism, if it is anything, is pretty robust. We don't ban religious proselytizing anywhere because it's protected by free speech. And we have a significant Muslim population, and there have been conversions, and they haven't produced violence. So I just was surprised by this claim. There are actual existing, I go back to the fact that there are actual existing religious societies that make this work. And, I can say in the future that, things are going to be different in the same way that I can say, this building's about to collapse, get out. But unless I have some basis for claiming that this building is about to collapse, I confidently predict that you aren't going to run for the exit.
But the Middle East will be... the Middle East, this does happen. There are Christian populations in the Middle East, there are Muslim populations in the Middle East, and of course we know it's a very unstable place for a reason.
What fundamentally sustains liberalism, what sustains free speech isn't a piece of paper, the First Amendment of the Constitution. It's a liberal political culture, which we've done a pretty good job of developing in the United States. They haven't got it in the Middle East. It's a fundamentally different society.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many sort of rich threads here to respond to. I mean, I largely agree with Philip, actually, and I think he's clarified now that we do in fact agree on this issue about not going back to neutral proceduralist liberalism. Because when I say liberalism, I just mean the state isn't going to use ideological coercion against you in your private life. It's not going to go and tell you to go to church or not go to church, or tell you to have sex or not have sex in your private life. And for me, that's minimal liberalism, right? So I'm not saying this idea of a neutral proceduralist state is one that we're going to see again. I quite agree. We might be in a post-liberal moment in that sense. I'm just setting a lower bar for liberalism here. The question about religion, apostasy, proselytization. Now, I think this is a very, very interesting question. I mean, I've looked at a lot of theological writing on this. I've written about this, as Andrew knows. I've argued that there are traditions within the Islamic intellectual tradition, there are strands of it that would reject this traditional view on apostasy laws and would say, no, it's actually unwarranted by the standards of our own religion. This could be a sincere belief. It is a sincere belief that some Muslims hold, primarily more educated Muslims in places like the United States. Now, nevertheless, until and unless that view becomes closer to the modal view of the modal Muslim in somewhere, even like Britain, and it's perfectly reasonable to have certain concerns. Do I think that responding to those concerns would necessarily require, even if Muslims became 20% of the British population, laws against proselytization, even if the modal views of Muslims didn't change? Probably not. Britain has a more functional state than the Middle Eastern countries. You can do opinion polls of Muslims in Britain. People who say that they would in principle want to ban apostasy is between 20 and 35%, depending on how you word the question. Okay, you can probably just contain them and bop them on the head if they try to kill apostates without banning proselytization. It wouldn't be an ideal outcome, but it might be a manageable and bearable one. Now, gay conversion therapy and abortion protests, I mean, again, I'll say something about the abortion case. We discussed it earlier. So here, yes, Britain might be less liberal than America or have a worse interpretation of liberalism. I would agree with that. However, it's still clear that many of the people, most of the people who endorse this kind of repression of pro-life speech think of themselves as liberals, think of themselves as acting for liberal reasons, think of themselves as protecting the autonomy conceived of in this radical, expressive, individualist way of the woman who wants an abortion or thinks she wants an abortion. So again, it comes down to what is the rationale they're using it. Well, you look at their psychology, you look at the beliefs they claim to be acting on. They claim to be acting on a radical view of autonomy. I've told a story of how it's spread by liberalism, and Andrew then wants to say, well, it's not the real liberalism, sure, but it's still spread by the liberal state. We're back to the same question here.
Okay, we have 15 minutes generously, so perhaps we should open it up to the audience for questions. I see them. Sorry, there's a microphone.
Quick aside before my question. Mention was made that truth is relative. I think that the concept we have now is truth is probabilistic. And I think that that's more what is more accepted, perhaps, at least among us scientists. But the question I have is this. I see the issue here more interestingly as the extension of liberalism that seems to be going on is one having to do with protectionism. Liberalism, as part of its sort of basic ideas of free speech and egalitarianism, etc., it has extended to protectionism. And protectionism, the particular issue that I think supports your view that biases of protectionism or the ways that we extend protectionism can filter down and cause oppressive behavior. We see now in the United States in the case of drug law. So drug law in the United States says these are the things you may not take, and yet there are a number of people in the United States who use drugs. Some are allowed to use them legally. You can use alcohol, and we know very well that that's at least as damaging as all of the other drugs that we proscribe. But it is filtered down that we have these drug laws, and now look what is happening. We actually have people being murdered, right? Up in Venezuela, the boats are being bombed now because the people who want to use drugs in the United States are being protected. How are they being protected? We're not going to let those drugs come into the country because these people might use it. So I would be interested in your views about the notion of protectionism and to what extent protectionism actually sort of supports some of the arguments that you all are making.
I might start with that. I wrote about drug policy a little bit in my book. I think it's actually a really interesting question. Another one that you really have to go down the rabbit hole on is psychiatry and the capacity to section people without having committed crimes, completely contrary to all liberal thinking, but pragmatically necessary, really. The drug question to me boils down to this. We are saying that you can do whatever you want effectively. I mean, drug laws are effectively unenforced in most countries. You can go to the United States and you can see people shooting up on fentanyl on the streets. I used to live in Boston. It was tragic. I'd see somebody slumped over when I was on my way to work. You don't know whether to call an ambulance or not because the ambulance person might just give out to you and say, oh, you're wasting our time. You don't know if the person's dead or not. It's a very sad society that produces, actually. And fentanyl's a lot more damaging than alcohol. The softer drugs are even more interesting because contemporary studies now are showing that some of the reefer madness stuff was correct. Very, very high potency marijuana can cause at least temporary psychotic breaks and can cause at least temporary psychotic violence. And I think what that actually, and you can relate this to mental health as well, the question that it raises for liberals is sort of what I got at earlier. If you allow people to do what they want, does it statistically or probabilistically cause chaos in your society? And is that fair? Is it fair to say, oh, well, everyone wants to smoke weed, so they should smoke weed? And then I come and I say, well, you've just increased the rate of completely random violence by, 20 or 30%. Is that fair to the people who suffer from the proliferation of random violence? I'm not even giving a clear answer to this, but I'm just saying that I don't think liberals have a very good answer to this for the very reason that I began with. It's an a priori abstract theory that's allergic to empirical realities.
So I wrote an article many years ago. If you Google it, you can find it. It's called Drug Policy and the Liberal Self. The basic problem for liberals is we're trying to protect people's ability to construct their lives that they want. And for varying from one drug to another, there are some people whose autonomy is defeated. They make mistakes that radically change their ability to control their lives. The problem with pretty much every drug is that there are some people who use the drug responsibly and they don't destroy their lives. I know people with PhDs who have at some point in their life consumed alcohol. It happens. And so that's whether the proportions and how you avoid the harm is just a problem of how you apply liberalism. The question of violence, I'm from Chicago. The worst drug-related violence that we experienced for a long time had to do with prohibiting alcohol. And we stopped prohibiting alcohol, and violence is characteristic of illegal markets. That's, I think, a distinctive question from the question of the harms caused by the drugs themselves, which I think it's a problem for liberals how to manage it. But the question, facilitating people's autonomy, I think that's the guidepost for policy. How you execute it in practice, like many policy questions, is hard and contestable.
I'll just add something to this and say that I think this question about the relationship between drugs and autonomy is one that actually illustrates the fecundity and the potential of a kind of moderate liberalism that might be based on or modified by natural law. Because if we think about this idea of autonomy, it's clear it can have radically different interpretations. You can read sort of certain types of libertarian who will argue that even the drug addict is, in a sense, exercising autonomy. We've already discussed cases about expressive individualism leading to really expansive conceptions of autonomy that are really, really demanding and actually end up requiring others' rights to be taken away. So what kind of autonomy are we interested in protecting? Well, I think your answer to that question really is going to have to depend upon a more robust, more comprehensive theory of the human good. And it seems to me that natural law theory has the potential to provide such a conception. It can say, well, what we're interested in is, to give just two examples, under the heading of autonomy, we're interested in the capacity of individuals to exercise the goods of integrity and authenticity, the capacity of individuals to align their deepest beliefs with their actions and with their emotions. To the extent that drug addiction threatens to undermine that, the state can take proportionate measures to contain it. To give the other example, we can say, well, individuals have a very, very, very important interest in what natural law theorists call the good of religion, which doesn't just mean religious worship like going to church, but it means anything that you think expresses your deepest beliefs about the ultimate sources of value or powers underlying the universe or lack thereof. So the atheist who thinks his highest fulfillment is achieved by taking drugs of some kind also has an interest in the good of religion that then can be, balanced against other things. So I think these hard cases for liberalism are cases where you need a more robust theory, and a kind of natural law theory can help provide that.
I got a mic, sorry.
Sorry.
Just quick question. Just why should a pious, devout Muslim adjust their beliefs to accommodate liberalism? Like, it seems like their beliefs, at least in their view, as a good person, as a pious person, come from God, while liberalism comes from the scrawlings of, some men in a war-ravaged Europe. And regarding that, it seems like liberalism itself was built to solve the chaos of a Europe that was ravaged by religious wars. If liberalism is now resulting in other kinds of chaos due to inherent contradictions within its own ideology, is it not time to, go back to the drawing board, see what bits we like, see what bits we don't, and see if we can come up with something that basically keeps the positive sides of liberalism while abandoning the internal contradictions?
Yeah, I totally agree with you on the Islam question. And if you go and talk to your Muslim taxi driver in the UK, where I used to live, he agrees too. That's what people think. And the reason that this hasn't been instantiated in politics yet in a country like Britain is because the critical mass hasn't been built up yet. By the time Britain is 20% Muslim, these questions will be on the table. And my guess is that the older Abrahamic religion will win out because it's more ideologically robust than liberalism. It has answers to questions. One of my big problems with liberalism, I keep talking about this proceduralism, this negativism in the ideology, a prioriism. There's no real answers to any questions in this thing. It's just this system of procedures. It's like a judge who you go in front of the judge and you say, "Can I please? Can you tell me if I'm allowed to get a divorce or not?" And he endlessly starts going through procedural rigmarole and never makes a judgment on the case. That's almost how I kind of view liberalism. I think the Muslim that you're talking about is absolutely right to ask that. What gives you the right to tell me? My ancestors have been living this way since, 800 or 900 AD. What gives you the right to come along and tell me that I'm not allowed to, put pressure on my family members not to apostatize? I'm not obviously in favor of that. I'm a Christian, but I see that once you start going down that route with the Muslim, you're going to start doing it to me. I can tell. Andrew?
Well, on the question of whether devout religion changes in response to social environment, this is the subject matter of the sociology of religion. And it is manifestly the case that people adapt their religious views to the society they're in without becoming any less devout. The classic book on this is by Peter Berger, who himself is a theologian and religious believer, but it's just manifestly the case that, we've got Muslims in the United States who, they function as good liberal citizens. I don't think that they're any less devout. They interpret Islam in a different way. And of course, we come back to Europe where, Christians thought that the way that you manifest your devoutness is by murdering your neighbors. And that's just what Christianity was. And I don't think that the shift away from that was because people became less devout.
So, to go back to your original question, why should a pious Muslim think that they should somehow adapt to or adopt liberal values? Well, the kind of reason that they're going to have, to the extent they have a reason, is going to be a reason that has to appeal to a theological reason. Now, I don't think it's impossible for pious Muslims to have a good theological reason. It might be, in certain respects, sociologically, culturally, or psychologically harder than it is for Christians. Nevertheless, I don't think it's impossible. There's a very, of course, medieval Islamic law said, yes, apostasy is punished by death, or at least 3 of the 4 schools said death, 1 said imprisonment. Now, nevertheless, there is clearly a belief within Islamic theology that says coerced religion has no value. So it's quite possible for a Muslim to say, well, precisely because I want to protect the free character of faith, I should oppose having apostasy laws today. Some Muslims do say that. I've pointed out there are Muslim thinkers who make this argument. Now, that's a quite different question, however, from the question of the sociology of actually existing Muslim populations. As I said, the modal Muslim, has many beliefs that are problematic by liberal standards, even by the standards of minimal liberalism. It's not true the majority of Muslims in Britain, even the taxi drivers, if you ask them, say they want to kill apostates. But 20 to 35% of them do, and that's still quite a lot. And maybe if they were 20% of the population, the sort of middle ground of wavering ones would tip over. That's quite plausible. So, taking steps to kind of contain the influence of unreasonable comprehensive doctrines in Rawls's sense is something liberals can do. You can take steps to contain the power of these interpretations of religion or other, deeply anti-liberal views. But I guess so does that mean, if a particular interpretation of a religion just clashes against even minimal liberalism? And here, I don't think Philip and I really disagree, because I don't think we disagree that, for Christians or for some Muslims, there is a way of reconciling their religion with at least opposing violent religious coercion, but it's not completely, not what Philip would call full liberalism, like a neutralist state. In that sense, we can just say, sure, we can appeal to something deeper than liberalism, but we can still do so within that at least minimally liberal framework and preserve at least the value of not killing each other or imprisoning each other for changing our religion. Pressuring people not to apostatize. I mean, again, pressuring is such a flaky notion. Everyone's pressured by everyone all the time, in families and communities, everywhere else. The question is about coercion. And we can, I think, agree on that baseline, or at least some people can. And I don't want to live in a society that has religious coercion. I don't think Philip does either. So in many ways, we agree.
Well, just really quickly, the gay conversion therapy people do want to stop the, telling people, suggesting or social coercion or something like that. I think it's natural. And really to clarify, just because I don't want to, Muslim taxi drivers in London do not say that they want to kill apostates. That was not what I was saying. They are frustrated with the decadence of the society around them. And I think as the Muslim population grows in Britain, I don't think some of these alt-right people or whatever, that they're going to impose Sharia law in the country. But I think there's going to be enormous pressure on government to impose laws that liberals won't recognise. Probably on alcohol consumption. I mean, how late it is. I remember talking to a Muslim taxi driver who said he hated the fact that the whole city was filled with drunks. He was worried about his daughter going out, so 10 o'clock closures, these kind of things. I think that's what I'm just empirically saying. I think that's what's going to happen. It might not be the worst for it, but we had one more, and it was in the principle of liberal fairness. I have to give this gentleman
Thank you, gentlemen. Want to bring up the issue of COVID. Just heard recently that the state of California is still pursuing the fines against Calvary Chapel for keeping their churches open when the state wanted it closed. I come from Canada. Many people had bank accounts seized from the truckers' convoy. So I guess my question would be, did the governments in most of the predominantly Western countries during the time of COVID act in a liberal fashion?
That's a really interesting question. I think that goes to what I was saying about drugs too, right? I mean, you're dealing basically with an epidemiological claim there. You're dealing with an econometric or an epidemiological claim. If you don't do X, Y number of more people will die, et cetera, et cetera. That's a similar claim that I'm making. If you allow mass smoking of very high potency marijuana, X number of people will die, and so on. I'll give you my short answer to the COVID thing. I don't think liberals can deal with stuff like that. Again, I'll go back. This is a procedural ideology that doesn't actually have a great deal to say about policy. I think, I'm not sure if we brought it up here, but we recorded a podcast earlier, and Jacob said that that as liberalism tends to go on, it tends to instill this notion of, well, you did say it, expressive individualism, right? I think that's actually what liberalism does. It sets up this neutral system of rules, which then actually create a personality type within the culture. But in terms of the rules themselves, I actually think I'm not saying they're useless for government, but I think they're largely useless for government. And when they're encountered with the marijuana example or the COVID example, I think they tend to just kind of go with the flow. And I think that's also why we see, and COVID's a good example of this, that what'll happen is the policy will then just kind of shift like this. It'll become hysterical. And in fact, that's what we're increasingly seeing in the West, that our governmental systems, just in terms of, basic stability, basic crime, basic public hygiene, etc., they're Hungary accepted, I must say, they're completely chaotic. And the standard of governmental capability seems to be falling as time goes on in these countries. And I don't think that's coincidental, because they can't answer things like COVID. Not really.
On the basic bottom line of government capability to deal with COVID, a vaccine was achieved with astounding rapidity, and millions of deaths were prevented. So this doesn't seem like a liberal failure. But specifically with respect to the question of religion, again, we're talking about actual existing liberal society and its law, not any abstract theory. The American law is that governments can enact laws, neutral laws of general applicability. Before the vaccine, there were good reasons for preventing large numbers of people from congregating together in the same space unmasked.
Shopping areas were opened.
I'm sorry?
Shopping areas were allowed to remain open.
The question is, well, I guess there's a threshold question. Was there any legitimacy at all in having a law that prevented people from congregating together in particular spaces? If you're going to ask me to defend every detail of American law, we will be here all night. But the threshold question is it okay for government to try to prevent the spread of a highly contagious, deadly disease? Absolutely it is. Now, then another aspect of American law is that religion gets special treatment. That the churches had claims that other folks who wanted to gather together didn't have, because there's the First Amendment's protection of religion allows for religious people to make claims for accommodation. And those claims were made. And then the question before the court is it possible to accommodate you without defeating the purposes of the law? And then the Supreme Court divided about the question of whether the courts ought to second guess the judgments of public authorities about what was too dangerous. Now, the structure of that question as presented by the court, there are different ways, and there was disagreement among the judges about that, but the fact that it was a religious gathering allowed for a claim to come before the court, which just wouldn't have had any weight at all if it weren't religion, seems to me to be a powerful counterexample to the claim that liberalism is hostile to religion. Religious people had a claim that was taken seriously in court that would not have been taken seriously by the court were it not religious.
Okay, so this is a fascinating question. I'm not going to talk about the details of US policy because I'm not really fully acquainted with them. And I talk about the principle of using coercion to prevent the spread of COVID or another disease. Now, before I talk about that, just to very quickly respond to Andrew, who said this is a good example of liberalism not being hostile to religion. Well, the claim I've been defending is not that liberalism is hostile to religion under the description religion or because it's about God or about theology, but under the description of upholding strong evaluation or, in particular regarding human sexuality. So, again, like the direction of travel is the important question, not whether the current Supreme Court majority thinks X or Y. Now, there's a very, very, very interesting question about COVID and lockdowns, and I think one could make a plausible case that the responses of governments to COVID, which appeared, as far as I can tell from reading the literature on this, to basically copy communist totalitarian China, the spread of these policies around the world is quite a good illustration of liberalism having this self-undermining tendency. Now, I think it might be quite plausible to argue the spread of expressive individualism is part of the reason that traditional negative liberties, like the right not to be put under house arrest without trial, which was part of the whole purpose of liberalism, in the 17th century, even back to Magna Carta, were devalued so much by governments. Vis-a-vis comfort, vis-a-vis not getting ill, vis-a-vis not contracting an illness that for most of the population wasn't particularly dangerous. Now, I'm not saying that a liberal state or a state that is minimally liberal, against coercion in your private life, but also upholds natural law, which is the kind of state I'm defending. And here, I think I converge with Philip, although we use different terminology. I'm not saying such a state could never permissibly institute a lockdown. But I'm saying the bar for doing so should be very, very high. It has to be absolutely necessary to prevent, people being exposed against their will, because they can choose to expose themselves if they wish to be being exposed against their will to the risk of death. Was it absolutely necessary in the case of COVID? I think looking back at it, it's very hard to argue that it was. COVID was not particularly dangerous to most people under the age of 70. The number of deaths was pretty trivial in those age groups, and you could simply have said, well, old people are going to stay at home and we're going to pay you to do so, and everyone else can do what they want. That would have been a more liberal and also a more natural law-based policy than what we saw, which seemed to me to be an illustration of the devaluation of the traditional liberties as a result of the kind of conditions that a liberal regime created.
Okay, we're over time and about to have a COVID riot, so that's a good place to stop. Thank you so much to our speakers for coming. It's been really great, actually. That was very substantial debate and very genteel and almost liberal in it. So thank you very much to Jake Williams and to Professor Coleman.